Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Live at the Waterhole. Where first up, we're in the Olifants West Reserve of the Greater Kruger National Park at Rosie's Pan with a lovely little group of elephants. Now, my name is Ralph Kirsten, and what does the bush hold in store for us today? Well, you'll have to sit back, relax, and watch as the animals come down to quench their thirsts and cool off. And as per usual, please don't forget that this is a live and interactive experience, so we'd love for you to jump on board with us and send us through your questions and your comments. You can do that by going on the Wild Earth website and registering. You can also join the conversation on X, formerly known as Twitter, using the hashtag WildEarth as it appears on your screen. What is it that you'd like to see? What would you like to chat about? Whatever it is, wildlife related, send it on through. Seems to be a small breeding herd. Maybe there are some more elephants around that we can't see just now. But lovely seeing that little youngster there. We had a leopard here a few days ago, just a very brief sighting. But with us going into winter now, there is more possibility and chance that we could see more predators coming for a drink, especially the likes of leopard. But you never can tell. Maybe even some lions and whatever else. It looks like they're just enjoying a bit of a feed now as well. Nice little thickets here next to the waterhole. And the little birds like the waxbills and the twin spots and the little mannequins, they do like coming to drink in that corner. But they won't be doing that with that elephant there, I think. And Catherine already coming through saying, hello, Ralph. Good to see you again. And lovely to have you on board, Catherine. And Darcy Miller saying, hello, Ralph. And Luyanda. Straight back at you, Darcy. Nice to have you on board. And Mercedes Bean saying, good to hear you, Ralph. Greetings, Wild Earth crew and chatters. Happy Monday. Yes, a very good start to the week. And what will it bring to us wildlife-wise? Well, that is to be seen. Joanne Mello saying, good Monday, Wild Earth. Lots of the regular viewers sending comments through. Fantastic. This looks like there's a little bit of wind around. Generally at this time of the day, you can expect some. Not too much though. I think there has been a lot of wind in these parts in the last few days. So nice to see it's maybe calmed down a little bit. I think they were getting the end of a massive system that worked through right up from Cape Town all the way up the east coast through the Eastern Cape into KwaZulu-Natal and then sort of ending off into the Lowveld. I don't think that they got as much rain or, because in KZN, massive floods. In fact, there was a huge tornado, which is quite unusual. I don't think many people have seen those around there. And Spaz Lankov saying, hello, Ralph. Happy Monday. Looking forward to great sightings today. Absolutely. And nice to have you on board once again. So, and speaking of that huge weather system that came through, I think it's time for us to go and have a look what the weather's going to be like across all the different locations. So it seems a typical crisp winter's day. Not going to get too hot, not going to get too cold either, but not much rain about. A little bit of cloud in some areas, but that's about it. So it does bode well for animals coming down to the waterholes. So just have a bit of a scan about and see what we might be missing while we're watching those elephants. Doesn't look like too much. Okay, so it looks like these elephants are a little bit camera shy and hiding themselves in the bushes, but lovely start nonetheless. I think it's time to change of place, so let's head on over to Namibia this time. I wonder if there's any east weather there, and Okukuyu. Well, it looks like we've got some more elephants that have decided to come for a drink. And I saw just some news while I was wondering about the east weather. You can actually see the wind blowing over our shoulders and over the water there. So it is east weather. And it's been howling down at the coast. And so much so that there's been areas where the road has been closed up by the dunes, which often happens this time of the year. And you get those berg winds, as we call them, coming down from the higher lying parts, normally much colder in those areas, and then blows over the hot desert, getting to the coast when it becomes like a second summer. But with it comes an immense amount of sand, and so much so that it's actually been seen from space. And satellite imagery showing that the sand gets blown sometimes more than 200 kilometers out to sea, and still seen on those satellite images. Here, grey hornbill calling, very raptor-like. And I'm just seeing the scimitar-like horns of the oryx or the gemsbok there on the opposite bank. They're just coming in for a drink. I think there's quite a number. It's either zebra or blue wildebeest also making their way through. So a couple more comments coming through. One coming from Erica Oldno saying, "Hi Ralph, from a sunny but chilly Cape Town." I think it's quite similar to where we are in the Eastern Cape. Probably a little bit warmer here, but after all that rain that we had over 200 millimeters in our parts in just a couple of hours. Hence why there was quite a bit of flooding around Port Elizabeth and East London. I don't think Cape Town got as much rain, but I think it's definitely quite chilly down there. So I hope you're keeping warm, Erica Oldno, and enjoying the lovely sunny views at the different waterholes. Then Asbo saying, "Good afternoon, Ralph, from a cold and wet East Anglia in the UK." Shame, I suppose that is why they call it the Mud Island. And, well, I hope this is at least cheering you up, Asbo. Now, I've managed to, and a lot of the regular viewers will know that when I'm hosting, I do like to delve into different topics and articles and all sorts. So, always on the lookout for anything interesting. And surprise, surprise, I managed to find something on Africa Geographic Stories by our very own James Henry. And this was written in 2021, but it's quite a long article, so I'll break it up throughout the different layers and parts of the show. But I think it's a lovely read. So while we're watching these elephants, it's entitled, "Do We Have an Elephant Problem?" And mainly centered around the numbers of elephants in the Kruger, but I'll let the article speak for itself. So I can't speak like James, but you can only imagine how he would be narrating this. At a dinner party, round a campfire, or in a pub, someone raises the topic of the elephant problem in southern Africa. When are they going to do something about the elephants in Kruger? They're just everywhere. They're destroying the place. You must see. The trees are down, debarking everywhere, dead baby trees, nothing for the other animals to eat. I tell you, those elephants are out of control. Somebody needs to do something about them. Often, the speaker has just returned from a dry season visit to the Kruger National Park, where every artificial waterhole they've driven past has been attended by a herd or two of elephants, and the vegetation in the vicinity has been decimated. If they've been out at midday, the dust, oppressive heat, and mangled bushes give the impression of their beloved park on the verge of desertification. Does our after dinner ecologist have a point? Do we have an elephant problem in parts of Africa? There's many strong held views and beliefs about elephants and how they should be managed. Many of these are not based on science, but on casual observation, cultural norms, stories, and experience, all of which vary widely, inevitably colored by a myriad of human bias. For whom is there an elephant problem and what is it? For our after-dinner ecologist, there are simply too many elephants. A rural farmer living with elephants might agree locally. For elephant conservationists, the elephant problem is a lack of space for our remaining elephants, which have suffered alarming population reductions on an Africa-wide basis. As many scientists and rangers have advocated for a while now, we need to take a more holistic view of elephants and their long-term effects on an entire system while considering changing landscapes, human beings living with elephants, anthropogenic changes to the land, and the elephants themselves. We'll look largely at southern Africa in this story, but many of the principles and ideas discussed apply anywhere elephants might live. So let's take a quick squiz at the history of elephants in the Lowveld of South Africa. Even though we're watching these ellies here in Namibia, not so congested as they are in the Kruger, but not far from here in the Chobe, similar stories abound, as have been mentioned here by our dinner table ecologist. So when the Sabi Game Reserve, roughly the southern half of the present-day Kruger National Park, was proclaimed, there were fewer than 10 elephants left in the area. Voracious ivory hunting had denuded the area of these great creatures, and while many thousands were killed for their ivory, many upped sticks and left the neighborhood for fear of falling to our insatiable desire for their teeth. And this situation has been escalating for a century or more until the herds that used to roam what is now the Kruger disappeared. So elephants are a keystone species. In other words, if you take them out of an ecosystem, then that system will change. Ecological engineers, as I like to call them. We do not have accurate records of the vegetation of the greater Kruger area prior to the arrival of the ivory hunters. When they arrived, they didn't take particularly accurate measurements of the vegetation structure or pay too much heed to the composition of the grass ward as they blazed away. So the indigenous people of the area kept no written records of the vegetation, and accurate oral histories of ecology from 200 years ago are almost certainly impossible to come by. We can infer something about the historical extent of woodlands in southern Africa from paleoecology. Such evidence indicates that woodland extension and the contraction seem to have been influenced by climate. Again, it's complicated to understand the relationships between elephants and woodlands in these times, nor is it possible to understand exactly what elephant numbers were. There definitely were more, but they had more space. Sorry, I'll just add in my little chirps as a part of his story. But a nice stop in here with these three bulls at Okukuyu. But I think we're going to jump around again. And this time, let's go to the Madikwe Game Reserve and Jamala. So it looks like it's turning into an elephantastic day once again. So I think the topic chosen is a good one. And the convergence of different breeding herds here, always wonderful to see the interactions between them. Always nice to try and work out who is the matriarch, who are the troublemaker youngsters, especially males, and who are potentially dominant bulls that come in onto the scene as well. So, and Joanne Mello was saying, haven't seen 1 ton yet, hope he is all right. Joanne, I did see him last week, and we saw him 2 days in a row, so I'm pretty sure he's fine. He was actually with another individual that also had huge tusks, not quite as big as him, but he had the potential for also being a big tusker. So it was lovely to see them both in excellent nick. So as far as I'm concerned, unless something's happened in the last couple of days over the weekend, I think he's absolutely fine. There's a little family of warthogs on the opposite bank as well. I think they've probably already been for their drink and now they're on their way out. Looks like some of those elephants, mother and youngsters, starting to move off as well. So a couple more comments coming through. One from Rebecca Bishop saying, I think this was my first time seeing oryx on a stream. Are they the same as gemsboks? So yes, Rebecca, they are gemsbok. It's the oryx gazelle. So, we often call them oryx for foreign viewers and also guests because a lot of people struggle to do the like you're going to spit, which is Afrikaans, Dutch, but it's actually stems from German, Gamsebok, because when they first saw them, it reminded them of the mountain goats in Germany. I don't think that they look anything like them. But at the time, they probably didn't have reference books and photos, and it was probably all just down to memory. And having not been around the Gamsebok for so long, maybe that's why it just reminded them of home and the animals that lived there. So that's where Gemsbok actually comes from, because the G in German would be said ga, but in Dutch and Afrikaans it said g. So Gamsebok became Gemsebok, but it's the Oryx gazelle. And we also do see a species in Kenya at the Oldonyo waterhole. We haven't seen them for quite some time, but a few months ago there was a lot of the fringe-eared oryx there as well. So we do have a chance, and I wonder when they'll be back. Then Liesel Minnar saying lots of elephants today. It's always lovely when the elephants are about. It's the animal that I look for the most, especially around midday. If I ever have day safaris, they're the best animals to go and view because they're very often active and enjoying themselves at the waterhole at this time, where a lot of the other animals are very lethargic, just standing in the shade. Predators pretty much just sleeping, um, with the odd chance of them moving around, but not much. And so, for me, the top contender for good sightings at this time of the day is definitely elephants. When Catherine was saying that sand can be blown very far, we regularly get Sahara sand in Germany. Yeah, it's amazing. But it's obviously also probably at a similar time of the year or similar circumstances where you have these very high winds that blow, creating those desert storms. And in my experience of Namibia and the desert, it always happens in winter, because that's when it gets very cold inland and the higher lying areas. And then that sort of pressure difference creates this wind that blows down towards the coast. And I know that they get a similar wind in France. So maybe this is where it happens. I mean, it's very close to Germany. Le Mistral. I'm not sure if they have another word for it in Germany. In South Africa, we have the Cape Doctor that blows. This is more the predominant wind, though, called as such because it blows everything away, including any virus and bacteria. That's how strong it is. Now, Jive Bunny saying, I'm always in awe of the lots of knowledge and experience coming through. Well, Jive Bunny, thanks. Glad you're enjoying it as we watch these ellies just sniffing the air in direction of the others. So, just continuing a little bit with James Henry's lovely article. Elephants' historical relationship with human beings is easier to understand, obviously, where we left off about the botany and the plants present in times gone by. People kill animals and always have. We are the most effective predator the world has ever known. Just ask the swathe of extinct species whose ghosts whisper in stories and travelogues. We do not tolerate wildlife that inconveniences us or threatens to kill us and our children. Meat is also an important protein source for human beings. This means that we have preyed on elephants from time to time for food and defense. So even before the colonists arrived with their guns, elephants would have avoided areas where human beings lived. And I know from reading a lot of historical African stories that even the likes of the great Shaka Zulu, King Shaka Zulu, who landed up being more powerful than Napoleon, he had more people under his control and more land as well. He used to hunt elephants for fun with spears. And it was the show of the true warrior to be able to, how many elephants you could kill. Not with guns, but with spears. I think it would have been incredible to witness. But yeah, not great for the elephants. It's just making the point. And the point of this trip back through time is to illustrate that we do not know what the vegetation looked like before the colonialists started blazing away, mad with ivory and bloodlust. This is important because this lack of knowledge has not stopped us from assigning dogmatic ideal variables to how the vegetation should look and then attempting to manage the biggest architects of the system based on supposition and unscientific dogma. As we hear those little blue wax bills constantly whistling away. Yeah, I think this is two young bulls having a go at each other, kicking up the dust. So then we get to the important question of where do elephants like to live? Well, they obviously like it here on Madikwe, where there's over 1,500 of them, but they like to live close to water and far from people. They're most at home in savannas and will avoid thick forest and grassland devoid of trees. They need shade in the hottest parts of the day, mud for cooling down, and a diverse range of plants to eat. They will graze where good grass is available and browse when herbaceous forage quality drops. When grass cover drops, elephants, especially bulls, have the greatest impact on woody plants. So elephants are now constrained from moving through much of their potential range, and they occupy just 17% of their potential range by fences and human habitation. They're no longer free to move through heterogeneous landscapes, suffering and enjoying the whims of climate-induced habitat change. Instead, elephants occupy smaller areas with insufficient space and heterogeneity of habitat for their numbers to stabilize naturally. The Kruger National Park, although large by national standards, is long and narrow. East-west migration routes between the coastal plains of Mozambique and the Drakensberg in the west have been cut off entirely. As a result, the variety of foods and habitats available to elephants are greatly reduced. Where bulls, the most destructive of the feeders, would previously have spent much of their time feeding on the floodplain grasses of the coastal plain, they can no longer do that in the Kruger region. And likewise, access to such habitat has been reduced by fencing and human activity. So elephants are lured to green croplands when times are tough, especially when cultivated fields are close to water sources. However, when the density of humanity or the land conversion attains a threshold, elephants will leave. Thresholds change from place to place. So how do they actually affect the vegetation? And the link between diminishing big trees and the presence of elephants is not as strong as it may seem. There's no question that elephants break trees. They debark them, they push them over, they stunt the growth as well. But in the process, they provide habitat for other species, disperse seeds, fertilize the landscape, and open up woodlands. In open systems, they seldom, if ever, destroy ecosystems irreversibly. They're massive animals, so the effect on vegetation is obvious to the casual observer, but the effect of their absence really isn't immediately obvious at all, yet it is no less profound. Research indicates that 1 to 4% of trees are destroyed by elephants each year in the protected areas of southern Africa. This level of loss may be supportable, but at the same time it must be appreciated that this kind of utilization will change the structure of the vegetation. And it's also important to understand that elephants are not alone in their destruction of trees. From seedlings to much larger individuals, for example, there's evidence to suggest impala eat a far greater volume of tree seedlings. And the combined effects of other herbivores, fire, floods, drought, and disease all contribute to tree survival rates. So elephants have an especially noticeable effect on the vegetation along riverbeds. Much concern is expressed about the destruction of marula, thorn trees, and baobabs in southern Africa. And they also tend to stunt mopani and combretan woodland. Little heed is given to three important factors here, however. Number one is a natural die-off of hardwood species and prolonged decay, and thus an accumulation of destroyed wood. Number two, the rinderpest epidemic and overhunting cut a swathe of destruction in the early 1900s, decimated wildlife populations, and numbers didn't recover for at least 50 years afterwards. So clearly this lack of animals provided an opportunity for unusual woodland development, especially along the riverbanks. The current usage patterns and vegetation structure in these areas are likely more natural, and this is reflected in floodplains throughout southern Africa. Number three, historically, where people lived, often along watercourses, they would have come into conflict with elephants through defense or predation. And this would have caused elephants to avoid areas of heavy human settlement. In turn, those areas occupied by human beings would have had a vegetation that exhibited far less elephant impact than those further afield. So there's one other thing to bear in mind when considering elephants and their effect on vegetation. Cycle of vegetation change in line with elephant population change in natural areas is almost certainly longer than a human lifespan. In other words, even dedicated scientists assessing elephants are just seeing snapshots of a much greater cycle in nature. Many scientists acknowledge this. That is very difficult to understand, much less manage for. So Catherine was saying that the face markings of the German gums are almost the same as the Gemsbok, but the rest looks nothing like it. She says it also tastes very similar too. So maybe it's around those face markings. Catherine, thanks for that. I never really understood how they could link the two together, except that they both have horns. And they are, sort of in the same grouping of animals, but other than that, they don't look much alike at all. So here comes some more warthogs. I'm not sure if it's the same little group that have decided to come back for a drink or if it's another one. So, having studied animal or wildlife management myself, nature conservation, um, we we obviously centered a lot around vegetation management, grass surveys, plant surveys, carrying capacities, and we got through all the formulas and the statistics, etc., that help you to work out your carrying capacity. And a lot of it sort of came down to past and historical experiences from previous rangers, and the experience that they had with the wildlife, and it was normally over long periods of time. But now that these elephants are just slowly starting to move off and heading towards the shade, I think we'll head off as well. And this time we go back to the Greater Kruger, but to Nkoro, where it's just elephants all round. Fantastic. This isn't too far from Juma. So So it can also move through those parts. So the point I'm making is that carrying capacities and this kind of science behind it has been worked out by past experiences of different sort of attempts at managing wildlife and the results that came from it. So we then apply and try to better through our own experience of managing wildlife on that previous experience that has been passed on to us by the rangers that were there and have taught us, and the scientists that have, worked it out for us. We take that work and we build on it. So when we speak of the golden carrying capacity, in 1967, when elephant culling began in earnest in the Kruger National Park, wildlife managers were focused on maintaining a natural balance of species. During the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, controlling animal numbers was the primary focus of much wildlife management. The Kruger National Park aimed to maintain the elephant population at 7,000. This number was based on a supposed carrying capacity of 1 elephant per square mile, but it's difficult to locate the exact science behind this number. Indeed, it seems rather conspicuous by its absence. I think you start somewhere and you see the results. Having studied this is the point that I sort of am putting from my experience of managing wildlife as well. More than 70,000 elephants were destroyed in their attempt to maintain the golden carrying capacity in southern Africa, mostly in Hwange, in Zimbabwe. And in so doing, protect elephant habitat and the species they shared those habitats with. But with hindsight, Mr. Captain Hindsight, and much better science, I think it's science that's built on top of those previous theories, and now we have results that we can work off of. So you have to start somewhere. But it seems that the culling program was rather simplistic. For starters, the amount of artificial water provided for animals in southern Africa does not appear to have affected the management approach to elephants. And there seemed to be ignorance, willful or otherwise, that pumping water everywhere was increasing elephant numbers through better survival rates and decreasing immigration. While the provision of artificial water may have been done with a greater good in mind, the results were dubious at best. As Professor Rudy van Aert says, the control of elephant numbers did little to address their impact. This is not surprising, considering that impact is due to factors other than numbers alone. Alan Savory, distinguished from many experts by his ability to admit to mistakes, was responsible for slaughtering 40,000 elephants in Zimbabwe during the 1960s. After that period in his life, he decided that elephants were not the problem and that culling them did little to improve the conditions of the rangelands where he worked. So much ado about water. And I think I'll be quiet for a little while and we just enjoy the sounds of these elephants drinking now. We'll carry on shortly. So, and Joanne Mello is asking Ralph, if they were to relocate Ellie's, would they take the whole family? Ethically, yes, Joanne. This youngster looks like getting stuck in the mud a little bit there. Engage your diff lock, buddy. Go for low range. There we are. Slowly get your way through. Well done, chap. So ethically, yes, Joanne, but you can imagine it's very difficult logistic-wise to do that. Elephants, it takes a massive project to relocate a breeding herd of elephants. So it costs a lot of money as well, and you need to have a lot of people involved, very often helicopters and vets. And then you stand the chance of, them dying as a result of the stress, heart attacks, if they too hot for too long, etc. So there's just so much involved with that it is possible, and they have done it, but it's a massive project and not easily done. That's for sure. Now, very often what they might do is choose like a breakaway herd that's just split from a much bigger breeding herd. It's got a new matriarch, and she's potentially just got some of her offspring. And then they'll take that group. So it is then the whole group, but it's not too big. And then at least it does help to make the project a little bit more easier. Cute little youngster, this. He looks like he wants to cause some trouble. Another couple of big individuals coming through. They look like they're in a hurry, and so I think they're quite thirsty. And once again, always interesting when different individuals meet up at the waterholes. See, there's a bit of submissive behavior. Looks like from a younger bull there, and he's getting pursued now. Yeah, there's still one drinking, just off on our right. Always a bit of dribbling when they suck the water up, and one when they're putting it in their mouth. So an elephants seldom go further than 10 kilometers from water. This is per Bruce Clegg, but I would say that's very much location dependent, because the Namib desert elephants, they stray more than 10 kilometers from water regularly. So I think really more so, speaking of the elephants here in Kruger, for instance, but I would say that population of desert elephants is quite special. So this is a generalization, but they ideally like to be within 5 kilometers of water. When food in the vicinity of water depletes, then elephants will move further afield. This movement creates stress, however, especially in drought times, and has a negative effect on calf survival. Nice close-up of this one. So, artificial water, such as this one, where it could have been a natural pan, but it's now maintained, or seasonal, now it's maintained as a permanent water source, clearly removes this effect and stress on the elephants. So in the large protected areas of southern Africa, water is concentrated in perennial rivers, and during the wet season, in annual streams and seasonal pans. And this distribution of water means that during the dry winter, elephants and other animals will congregate along perennial water sources and spread out during the wet summer. So clearly, movement like this will allow a heterogeneous use of the landscape by browsing and grazing herbivores. Up until 1994, more than 300 artificial water points blossomed in the Kruger. Unsurprisingly, the elephant population increased. This was great initially because wildlife needed to be nurtured and was recovering from more than a century of pillage. But the maintenance of the water points into the 1990s was ill-advised. Likewise, the provision of water in the Hwange National Park, Etosha National Park, and Chobe National Park accentuated the impact on vegetation in the vicinity of the water. It intensified die-offs during droughts, and it still does in some cases. But it's not only the elephants that benefit from the provision of artificial water. Wildebeest, zebra, and impala, particularly the latter, too, are highly dependent on water and will not stray far from it. When their numbers increase in the presence of artificial water, they outcompete some species as well as attracting predators. So more mixed feeders like impala mean a greater toll on tree seedlings. In the Kruger, this meant the demise of healthy sable, roan, and eland populations, and also the local extinction of brown hyena. So if we look at the private reserves on the western boundary of the Kruger, we see a patchwork of tiny properties with landowners all managing for their or their tourists' needs. And all the little properties have numerous dams and pumped pans. And many are the times I've heard landowners bemoaning the fact that the elephants are pushing down trees, but not making any connection to the fact that by pumping water, they're ensuring that the elephants don't ever have cause to leave their land. Pumping water means that the most desperate times, droughts, when trees are most likely to be pushed over for forage and also their roots and the sugars in them, are precisely the times when elephants will concentrate on their land. So they use areas close to water much more intensively than they do areas further afield. If water is equally distributed across the landscape, as it is in the Sabi Sands, for example, compared with the Kruger, where there are now large swathes of land without artificial water, then the impact of elephants will be uniform. And areas that might build up a bank of forage that could be used in times of drought are used intensively all the time, when the consequence that die-offs from starvation during drought are that much more intensive in areas where water is provided. Okay, so looks like only one bull left for now, but that was lovely having them coming through. So I think we'll also leave and let's head on over to Kenya with Old Donyo. With a lovely close-up. It's not 1 ton, but a lovely big bull nonetheless. Still haven't seen any breeding herds coming through here yet. I'm sure at some stage we will, but it seems to be just resident bulls that keep and like coming through for a drink. So, are the elephant population numbers increasing or decreasing? In much of southern Africa, elephants have not been intensively managed. We've given them water in some places and provided anti poaching. In South Africa, we've subjected them to far more intensive management through the provision of huge amounts of water, culling, translocations, and fences. And population growth in South Africa is less variable and much higher than in areas where elephants are left alone, suggesting that our well meaning intentions have actually stimulated population growth. You might be surprised to hear that elephant numbers in southern Africa are actually relatively stable. In northern Botswana, the elephant population has remained stable at around 130,000 animals for more than a decade. There's some debate over this number, but it is possible discrepancies come from cross border elephant movements. And this is not to dismiss any concerns about their impact, but it does suggest some sort of natural equilibrium being reached. How long this might last is not clear, and the situation should be constantly evaluated. A lot of the private reserves that are private landowners that have elephants on their property mainly use contraception as a way of controlling their numbers. Um, so, in so doing, just slowing the birthing rate of the females. And in some instances, there's even been vasectomies of the males. I've been part of some of that too. And so I think definitely more humane than culling. But the true reflections of those birth controls is still and yet to be seen because this has only been done in the last 10 to 15 years. And so slowly but surely, we may start to see the social um, repercussions of different groups of elephants not giving birth, or at least not giving birth to as many babies. I think a lot of impact could be seen in the females, but it is still to be seen, I think, as we wait on the results. Now, obviously, we always have to talk about the human elephant conflict. And one of the major calls for elephant numbers to be reduced comes from people living amongst them, outside or near unfenced protected areas. And this is understandable. Very few people, especially those who could lose all their whole deer, their crops, their family, and their livestock, in a single aggressive elephant encounter, could tolerate the risk to life and livelihood. Sadly, the plight of rural people living with elephants has been co opted by politicians and elements of the trophy hunting fraternity to encourage the lethal reduction of elephant numbers. It's doubtful that trophy hunting, unless implemented on an industrial scale, will have any effect on human elephant conflict. It may even cause the reverse by making elephants more terrified of human beings and therefore increase the likelihood of aggressive encounters. I'll always refer to the very famous bull of Namibia, Voortrekker, who is the father of the populations in the Ugab Huab regions and a very big part of the genetics that are there now, who was destroyed as a problem animal when he was not. So he was sold to a trophy hunter. Even after the permit to hunt him had been bought by an organization very close to me that I've worked with, um, and so he was he was owned already in terms of the the permit to hunt him. But they then deemed him a problem animal and sold his trophy. So I think very much agreed on this point of political decisions made around human elephant conflict. Maybe he could have gotten into a village once or twice, but there were alternatives and still are for assistance from these organizations that are very active in those parts. So I think it's a real shame. And I just think ultimately came down to greed. And that's about it. So sometimes we need to look a little bit deeper into, um, these wildlife instances where there's problem animals. Sometimes they're not really a problem. There's just money to be made. That's, I think, the root of all evil. So Spaz Lankov was asking, are contraceptives effective in controlling the population of the elephants? Spaz, it is effective. It lasts, the birth control for the females, they normally administer it with a dropout dart. So what that means is the needle doesn't have a barb on it, but it administers the dosage upon impact on the elephant, and then literally just falls out. Sometimes shortly after, other times a little bit longer, but that's how it is administered. And then it normally lasts for around about 2 years. So it will then break up the sort of pregnancy cycles of the females. They'll obviously choose which females to dart. And it has worked, especially in these smaller areas on private game reserves, etc., where it's very easy to track and monitor the herds, and know them, by individuals. And so it's been very effective and a great tool for them to control the numbers of elephants, especially on smaller properties. So Erika Oldno is asking, what about long-term side effects like in humans? And I think that would be around the contraceptives, and it's hormonal. Um, so, I'm not a vet myself, but I think, as I was mentioning, the results are still to be seen, and the side effects we're still going to have to study and see, the side effects, both physically and emotionally, as in their social structure. with the slowing of the birth rate, it could definitely have social impact within the groups and emotional. Um, so I think it's difficult for us to know until we've let the cycles of different generations of elephants go through. And as we start seeing trends, we could then start to report back on that. He's gone deadly still, like there might be another one around. But what a wonderful sighting this was. And we'll be jumping around a little bit. It's been wonderful. It seems like there's been elephants everywhere. So I think another change is due. This time, let's go back to the Madikwe Game Reserve, but this time to Tau. Surprise, surprise. The elephants are out here too. Wonderful. Joining all the waterfowl that are resident here in this particular waterhole. I think just in between these elephants are those spoonbills, white birds, look like it. So Catherine was saying that often shooting the old bull leads to problem elephants amongst the younger bulls that have no older one to guide them and keep them in check, I would say, Catherine. I heard the people in the area had more problems with Ellies in the villages after Voortrekker was killed. Definitely. The real calming figures, and Voortrekker was, as the name suggests, he was the pioneer that came through that area. He was definitely the dominant bull, and definitely a lot looked up to by a lot of those younger ones and kept in line. You see there the crocodile out on the bank. Wonderful. So yes, as human and or elephant populations grow outside of protected areas, such in those areas between the Uhab and the Huab, they are growing, but there also has been quite strange young elephant die-off and mortality rates that they were trying to work out why the babies were not surviving through to adulthood. Um, Whether it's resource based or if there was actually something more to it. We didn't quite know at the time that I was last up in Namibia. But the chances of conflict between elephants and humans will always increase when we have these instances. And we have very similar habitat needs. So human settlements need to be close to water as well. While the growing of crops in fertile soil attracts the attention of elephants as well, especially the bulls. There's a lot of people working to mitigate the conflict between elephants and people in rural areas. However, it must be noted that while elephant populations in unfenced areas across southern Africa are relatively stable, human populations aren't. They're growing. Therefore, defining the problem in terms of the number of elephants alone is incorrect. That said, it's crucial that rural people don't see elephants as a threat to survival. Ideally, they need to benefit from elephants through tourism and, as much as it stings to say, perhaps through protein and trophy fees, avoiding targeting large tusked animals and removing their genes from the population. The bottom line is that the people who live with elephants have to see an advantage to their existence. And going back to one of my wildlife lecturers, he always said, if it pays, it stays. So I think a real balanced, broad spectrum approach to elephants is required. We cannot say that there should be no hunting of elephants at all. I think balancing it, limiting it, and when there is hunts, make a lot of money out of it. But with a scientific approach as to the selecting of the individuals to be hunted. Very often those hunters come only for the trophy. I'm not a fan of trophies on walls. I don't like it, but I look at the bigger picture, and we need to remember this. As we see that one individual now going close to that crocodile, let's just see what happens there. Quite nervous, ears are out. Crocodile's not moving. He knows it's there. Is he going to try and shift it? I love these kind of interactions. He's maybe going to kick some dirt at it. Or is he just going to ignore it? They all know it's not. It's just moved a little bit. I think mommy's told him, don't stick around there, please. That's dangerous. Oh, and there's the second one there as well. So I think a real balanced approach. There needs to be tourism. There needs to be some hunting, controlled, specifics, and make a lot of money out of it. And very often when those guys come for those trophies, that's all they pay for. So the meat then can go for the locals, who are also employed for the likes of these hunts, as trackers and to help with accommodation, whatever it might be. So there's a real impact in the community, and they benefit greatly. And then also training them in to be guides so they can bring guests for tourism, etc. I think we shouldn't be shooting down, excuse the pun, hunters and any part of the aspect. We're all human beings. We're all part of it. We're all in it together. There are people that will always want to hunt. We need to use them to the benefit of the wildlife. And the money that comes in from them, we can then use for conservation. But as I say, if we don't control it, then it very often moves to the black market, and then the likes of voortrekker gets shot, behind or through the back door. We want them to come in the front door, and we want to do it and tax them and get the money and get the conservation uplifted and the communities with it. So that's my take on it. So Jack Sultan saying it looks like they're very thirsty. It's almost as if elephants are always thirsty, Jack, and they can drink a lot of water in one sitting, that's for sure. And also saying that absolutely gorgeous views of nature. Wow, keep up the good work. Thank you, Jack, and thanks for joining us. Then Joanne Mello saying that relocation is the answer. Joanne, it's, as we've been discussing, we're getting to the point where there's almost nowhere to send them. Where are we going to relocate them to? Because all of these wilderness areas are, if we go on the carrying capacity, at it or even over it. So people aren't going to want to have more elephants relocated onto their properties. Maybe we can find new areas, sure. Wilderness areas have been growing in the recent past because of a lot of farmlands being turned into game farms and private reserves. But there's not one game reserve that I know of, private reserve I'm talking about, that wants more elephants. In fact, they're all trying to control their numbers. So I'm not so sure that translocation is the answer. It has been in the past when, this increase of these wilderness areas have been occurring, and there's been that real economic drive because we have a lot of tourists coming through. But if that dries up, or we have the likes of COVID again, it's the wildlife is going to suffer. And if we can't get money coming in from tourists, eventually it's going to have to go back to farming, traditional farming methods, and that would be livestock and agriculture. And so then we would have a big die-off of elephants once again. But I think a multi-pronged approach is always the key, and having a balanced take on it, and always looking at the bigger picture is of utmost importance. All right, so fascinating little sighting this with the elephants and the crocodiles, who seemingly haven't really moved. But we're going to move, and we're going to move back to Old Daniel. Got some of our zebras that have moved in. We haven't seen them for a while, and if there's enough of them, they can even push the elephants out of the water. Which, if you haven't seen it before, this is one of those spots that it happens. All right, so obviously lots of emotion around what I'm talking about, especially when we get to trophy hunting, and that's great. And I like that we speak about it, and we all have our own opinions, and we all need to have them, regardless of whether you're pro or against. Your voice counts. So Spaz Lankov saying, for me, trophy hunting is not tourism and doesn't help conservation. Somehow the community needs to know how to protect the animals, Ralph. So I disagree, Spaz. Trophy hunting is tourism and it does help conservation. However, and this is the caveat, it needs to be scientifically approached, and which individuals will be taken out, have they passed on their genes, etc. There's a massive amount of money that does go through to conservation through trophy hunting, but I think the indiscriminate use of trophy hunting as an economic input is the problem, the ethics, and so on. So that's where I'm saying that more targeted trophy hunting, not as a whole. I think reduce trophy hunting, don't eliminate, but it needs to be scientifically driven as to which individuals are taken out. Because the amount of money that comes into communities through trophy hunting is immense. So we cannot say that it does not add to conservation, because it does. And I know that it does in vast areas. So, but the problem is, as I was saying, is when we have trophy hunting without scientifically backed approaches, that they're indiscriminately taking out the big animals and those genetics. Sometimes you may have an elephant bull that is a trophy animal, and the area is suffering for a lack of economic input, but the elephant is now heading into his latter years. He's been attacked by some of the younger bulls and nearly killed a few times. The next one could be, when he dies. So that, for instance, could be a bull that could be targeted for trophy hunting, and then you're talking, $50,000 for that. And it will take a lot of tourists to add up to that one trophy hunter. So I say in specific instances, I think trophy hunting does still have a big part to play when it's very controlled. Sanjeev Roy saying, but Ralph, your solution created a furore in Amboseli where big bulls were killed by trophy hunters near the Tanzanian border. And rightly so, Sanjeev Roy. I'm glad that it did create a furore, not that the bulls were killed, but it seems like this was an indiscriminate trophy hunt, if I'm getting what you're saying correctly. And then I'm glad that the furore was kicked up, because that's what we should do. But in many instances, it's similar with rhino horn. I always liken it back to drugs. Cocaine and heroin, you're not going to stop the demand for it. You can try and strangle it, but it very often then hits onto the black market. And that's when you have the big problems, because people are going into shady, dark corners and they're becoming criminals. Whereas if we look at likes of countries that have legalized it, they control it, they tax it, they support people that are, creating the demand. And we actually have less problems with drugs in those parts. Where we have contraband of the likes of rhino horn, which the demand has not decreased, I think that in some way we need to be able to supply that demand, tax it, control it, and in so doing also educate and try to squeeze the demand a little bit, but using that money that you get in, once again returning to conservation and for anti-poaching as well. So I think in a big way, as I say, we need to look at the bigger picture. We also need to understand the local communities living near to these animals, and very often are the poachers and the people that are paid to go and kill these animals, or paid to track the trophy lion or whatever it might be, leopards, on the black market. Whereas if it was controlled and it was in the light, legal, we would have less abuse of the system. And I fully believe that. And it's not to say that I'm pro trophy hunting. I'm pro a bigger picture, balanced approach from all sides, that you supply the demand and you also uplift the communities that are affected and live in amongst those wildlife on a local level. So heterogeneity, which is a key management objective. And the key goal for most conservation organizations is to improve and maintain biodiversity. One of the ways of achieving this is to manage areas for maximum heterogeneity. In other words, management for an area like the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Park needs to maximize the number of different habitats. Some of these will be prime areas, some marginal, some vacant, some occupied. Densities should vary naturally across time and space in accordance with patchy resource availability. In large enough areas, this heterogeneity of landscapes would ideally result in subpopulations that will vary in number, growth rates, etc. So these would then be managed through the lens of a meta-population. One of the ways that the Kruger is currently aiming to do this is by closing waterholes and leaving large areas with no artificial water. Between 1995 and 2008, Kruger management reduced the number of waterholes from 340 to 116. So it's halved. And this allows less water-dependent species to flourish in the absence of competition from those that are more water-dependent. And indeed, SANParks management's initiatives focus on spatial manipulation to control impact rather than command and control approaches, which were used between the 50s and the early 90s. So, our after dinner ecologist doesn't understand that when he drives his family down the main road between Mopani and Shingwedzi rest camped of an October midday, the waterhole that looks as if it's an apocalypse has befallen it is placed where it is so that he and his family will see the elephants and other animals coming for their midday snifter. So he's failing to understand that the proportion of the park he can behold is a very tiny fraction of the entire system, and one that, because of the waterhole's location and time of year, looks fairly dire. We can compare that with the likes of the Jamala waterhole, which has seen massive amounts of elephants over the last few months, and we've been here to witness it. And you can see the area around it is apocalyptic, very dry and dusty, and not much growing. So reducing artificial water is probably the most important intervention we can make. Closely distributed waterholes cause uniform impact over an area. They reduce roaming distances and reduce stress on young elephants, increasing their survival rates. Closing water points results in more intensive use of vegetation around the water, which could cause stress on calves and reduce population growth. But at the same time, vegetation away from water can recover. So clearly this only applies to large heterogeneous areas and not to small fenced reserves, where much more direct management of elephants is required, like I spoke of, with contraception, translocation, which is becoming very difficult. So it's now mainly contraception. The larger the area, the greater the chance that elephants will experience a variety of living conditions that could limit their population growth rates across the region and possibly across the continent as well. So lovely to have these zebra back, and I'm hoping that they'll increase in numbers as the days go by. But time to change once again. This time we're going to a new spot, KwaZulu-Natal and the Tembe Elephant Park. Where, not to be outdone, there's also lots of elephants, joined by some impala. They're generally like hanging around on the opposite bank there, here in the foreground. So Kendall B was saying, I saw a documentary that New Zealand tried the legalization route and it didn't quite work and created more addiction issues and now cartel activity and heightened violence in the country. Could a similar thing not happen with wildlife and poaching if we tried that way? Well, Kendall B, that's pretty much what we have now. We don't have cartels, but we do have gangs and very high level individuals within government and politicians and authorities that are involved with it because of the amount of money that is to be made. So, yes, that is indeed the problem, and it's a difficult one. Looking at that bigger picture, we can have a perfect theory, but it doesn't always work in different parts of the world. So I'm just thrashing this out, and lovely to get the responses, either for or against. Most, I would say, are going to be against. That's also fine, but I'm just trying to paint a picture that what we're currently doing, I would say, is not stemming poaching. I think there's a big reduction in poaching in certain parts because there's just no rhino left, for instance. So we can't claim that as a victory. They're moving to other areas where there are rhinos. But the numbers that were in the Kruger are no longer there. And you hear a lot of reports of people that have been to the Kruger now. They couldn't drive 2 kilometers without seeing a rhino. Now they don't see one on a 2-week trip. So it's definitely had a huge impact there. We need to try something. And I think that could work, but it could fail as well. So I'm not saying that it's a perfect solution, but the current one ain't cutting it. And with the increase in populations of humans, we're going to have more problems of poaching. I'm sure of it. Then Rebecca Bishop is saying, I suppose the issue with birth control is making sure enough are on it to control the population, but not too many are on it that it causes the herds to decline. Yeah, so Rebecca, absolutely agreed. And it's not actually about population decrease or trying to decrease the populations. It's literally slowing the increase of the population so that it's just more easily manageable. But as I say, mainly on those private reserves, and so that you can slowly let a more manageable balance occur, where you're going to start to have mortality rates picking up versus the natality rate or the birth rate, and trying to balance that and keep the population at a similar size. Then Sandy was saying, so it sounds like trophy hunting is all about the money. Sandy, it definitely is about the money, the input that it brings. Obviously for the person doing the actual hunting, it's for his enjoyment of the bush and also hunting. So on that side, there's a big portion of the population that enjoy this, and that's their prerogative. So, but the world is about money. We're in a capitalist society. We cannot get away from it. You need money to survive, and these local communities near to these reserves very often have very little money. So they're on the breadline, and you cannot get away from if somebody offers them money to help with either poaching or whatever it might be. They're going to try because of how much money they have, which is very little. And then it also goes to food. Very often, all the snaring, we get angry about it, but it's people trying to survive. That's for food. So literally, some of them don't have anything to eat. So they go in there and they snare the animals, and then they can eat. So I think it's just the results of human nature and where we've got ourselves to as a planet and as a race, where we do need money to survive. And if you don't have money, then you go and find and catch your food, and you do that by poaching. So hunters pay to shoot animals, poachers don't. That's the only difference. So Lady Macbeth saying birth control is certainly one option, but there are no easy answers. I've been involved in deciding what happens to a herd which got too big for its reserve, and the decisions are unsatisfactory. It's difficult, Lady Macbeth. There's no easy answer. It's absolutely, and I agree with you. I just find it difficult when people have such an aggressive response to even thinking that hunting can be part of conservation, because it is, and it will be. We need to work with those people, and the issue of hunting as a unit, as a collective. We can't just sit back and point fingers and call each other names that achieves nothing. And that's what a lot of our response to people that hunt is. And I don't think it's helping. So I think it makes certain people feel better to have an outburst and to try to degrade somebody, whether it's on social media or wherever it is, but there's no engagement, and to try to work out the issues, bearing in mind their sort of desires as well. Because if you don't think about theirs, why should they think about yours? So we need to find a balance, not only from them, but also from the naysayers. Everybody needs to be included. And we also need to then think about the local community. How are they going to benefit? Because if they benefit from the wildlife, they will protect it as their own. But if they're getting money from killing the animals and taking them out of the reserve, it's not working for the greater good of the wildlife. So that's why I say involving everybody in those decision makings, making everybody's point heard and that it counts. But then we have to be civil to each other and we have to engage in these conversations. That's why we're having it, and that's what I love doing. So keep those comments and questions coming in, no matter what it is, but let's keep it civil. And Taxi Lady saying, until humans have a natural predator, this is unwinnable. I don't think so, Taxi Lady. I think we've just got to engage with each other a little bit more on the same level than we have been. Not so much shouting and name calling, which achieves nothing. So we have to accept that people are different, and they have different desires, and they have different capital and monetary inputs and geographical locations where they come from and cultures, etc. This all needs to be taken into account. We cannot just point fingers at the poachers, at the trophy hunters. We're all in this together, and I will keep saying it. But ideally, elephant areas need to be joined with corridors, as well as augmented with buffer zones to create a variety of landscapes and habitats, and uneven use of vegetation. So in many parts of Africa, elephants roam widely out of protected areas, which are also important repositories of biodiversity, even when people are present. So it's here that elephant-human conflict must be mitigated, and people who are expected to live with elephants should benefit from their conservation in some way. And this is as distasteful as this may be to many of us, arguments in favor of hunting must be heard. Adaptive management is also crucial, and the questions are complex and require dynamic solutions based on a constantly changing knowledge base. We need to continually rethink conservation and management, especially of keystone species that are both emotive and emotional. The command and control approach to keeping the balance of nature is no longer in vogue outside of small parks, given way to approaches that aim to mimic the dynamism of natural systems. Modern approaches focus on land and ensuring the integrity of ecological processes rather than on elephant and other species numbers. In the case of elephants, this means excluding them from sensitive areas and restoring areas by removing artificial water, as has been done in the Kruger. Transfrontier parks also play a massive role. The fewer fences we have, the more easily elephants can move between protected areas. The less concentrated their effects will be, as long as we do not discourage immigration by providing water. And once again, why do those lodges put the water next to their lodge? Because it increases the interest of their lodge and it brings them more money. So whether you're the lodge owner with a artificial waterhole or a poacher from the community on the outskirts of the game reserve, or a big game trophy hunter from America that comes with lots of money, you're all part and parcel to the experience of the wildlife and what happens with them. So that's where I say a more balanced approach, I think, is very, very important. And as human beings with an interest in nature, it's imperative that we understand that we do not have the historical records or ecological understanding to be implementing those command and control approaches, especially to the conservation of keystone species in large protected areas. We have to manage the land for heterogeneity and do our best to mimic nature while accepting that anthropogenic landscape changes are irreversible in some places. We also have to accept that sometimes, as a very last resort, lethal measures may also be necessary. So, do we have an elephant problem? It depends on your perspective, where you live, what piece of land you are referring to, and what your goals are. As with all things in nature, it's a question with answers more complicated than our current understanding. So Erica Oldnose says a higher level of consciousness is needed to see how animals in their habitat have just as much right to be here as we do. It's complicated. I agree. It is, Erica. But we must also remember that we do place ourselves, as with any species on the planet, as the most important species. And what I mean by that is that, you know, as would anybody, I would never let an elephant harm my child, for instance. So I will kill an elephant if it means that without doing that, it would kill my child. And so this goes to livelihoods of people. And it's such a huge topic that we always need to remember that you never know what you will do until you're faced with a certain set of circumstances. So I've often had guests and viewers tell me that they would never poach. I must disagree, because if you haven't eaten a proper meal in 2 weeks, firstly, you'll be surprised what you'll eat. And secondly, you'll be surprised what you'll do to get food for your children to eat. And that may include illegal practices and killing of animals. But I would do it if it meant the survival of myself and my family. So I'm not immune to that either. And if you've never been hungry, properly hungry, not for one day, for 2 weeks, you won't know what it feels like, and you won't know what you will do in those instances. So I think if there's an upliftment of those communities through a balanced approach, the less people we're going to have desperate to be doing things like that. And Dusty Cole saying all speaks to equitable, fair societies. It's all related. Good conversation. We need to talk to figure it out. Exactly. And when you see the inequalities, I mean, I look in my own country, in South Africa, you've got the richest of the rich and the poorest of the poor. And very often the poorest of the poor are living just next to this wonderful wildlife that we're watching. And you see the richest of the rich going into these reserves, paying high-end hotels and lodges to stay, and just a few kilometers away, There's people that are starving. But we want to berate those people for laying snares. It's a terrible thing. Snares are disgusting, especially when you see the results of how the animals die. Very often tortured. Sometimes takes weeks for them to die, at least days. But it's all for that inequality and those people on the boundary that don't have the same privileges as the people on the inside. And you don't hear those people complaining about the animals being snared because they're the ones that are hungry. So that's what we need to always remember. And before we shout and call people names and how disgusting they are, we need to walk a day in their shoes. There's impala happily grazing here, enjoying this lovely greenery. So, and Lady Macbeth saying, and they had their land, homes, and hunting rights taken away when that land was given over to conservation of animals and were provided with no means of surviving in return. And this is very important, Lady Macbeth, because very often in the communities that are bordering onto these reserves, exactly as you've mentioned previously, and their forefathers would have, been living on the parts of now current national parks. They've been moved off that area, and they would have been able to literally harvest what was around them to survive. Now they don't have that. They almost have a resentment in a lot of cases for the national parks, especially if they're not getting, the jobs that are in the lodges, etc. Um, they're on the outskirts. They're not involved. They're not profiting. You know, yeah, they have a real resentment for the wildlife because, as a result of the presence of them, they've been stripped of their rights. So I think we need to uplift them a lot more, and more work needs to be done with the local communities to the point where they are working to conserve the wildlife that they are profiting off of. That's how it needs to sort of result, because we can't be just giving them things, or they shouldn't just be given things. There needs to be incentive for protecting the wildlife, and bringing them into the working fold. That, for me, is a big part of it. And then us, as the conservationists, need to include all the spheres of different people: the average tourist, the hunters, the local community. And once we find a balance between all of those aspects, then the wildlife will thrive. So we've been on a whistle-stop tour of all the different spots, and this has been lovely as always, especially with all the elephants. But that's not going to change, but we are going to change of place, and we're going back to Old Donyo. So I think of the areas in these parts of Africa where the Maasai people are, in a real land sharing sort of initiative between the wildlife and their livestock. I witnessed it myself. It was an incredible sight into the Mara Triangle. It's one of the wildest places I've ever been to, with prides of lions like I've never seen in concentrations like that. It felt to me every 2 kilometers there was another pride of lions. My father always told me a million times never to exaggerate, but I'm pretty sure that it was almost like that. And as a result of the migrations, lots of food availability during those times, but obviously, when those migrating zebra and wildebeest aren't there, they struggle a bit. But the Maasai people drive their cattle into the Mara Triangle, into the greater Masai Mara at night, and they graze their cattle and they move them out before sunrise. And every single day this happens. And from the Olololo escarpment, I used to look down at night and see the lights of the herders with their cattle grazing down on the plains. And I would just think that those are absolute warriors. They are legends in present time, because they are down there with those prides of lions with their livestock, and some of them just had that small little torch, and they're going in there. I just thought it was crazy, crazy brave, but a lovely power. sort of sharing of the land between the local community and the wildlife, which then also brings in people, tourists that stay in the lodges, etc. So I think it's on this foundation. Look, there's always problems, and it's the management thereof. There's always loopholes to the rules as well. We did hear of sort of um, people driving their cattle, in the intent of them getting eaten by lions, because they get compensated for the cattle that are eaten. So, sometimes they might struggle to sell some of their cattle, or they need a bit of cash, and then they drive them towards where the lions are, and then they can claim their money. So there's always issues with rules and regs, but I still think overall that this is a kind of way of involving the community, that they really do benefit from the wildlife, and they're a part of the decision making as well. So lots of comments coming in, just enjoying the candid discussion, that it's been a wonderful topic, and how deep we're going into it. I'm glad that you're all open also to controversial subjects, because I think those are the ones that need to be spoken about the most. If we push it under the carpet, it's only going to get moldy and become more of a problem, and it's going to smell more too. So we need it out in the open, spoken about, thrashed about, um, but always just remembering to speak to people as and on your level. Um, we can't just be pointing fingers and blaming others, when we're all part of this place that we call home, and the wildlife that coexist with us. So I think if that's my message of today, we've sort of discussed the issues, the problems, the possible solutions, but I think we should just be kinder to each other and more open to each other's ideas, backgrounds, and beliefs and interests, and input. The more we do that, I think the more effect positively we can have on our surroundings, on each other, and on the wildlife as well. Not too long before the end of the show. I'm going to be back here again tomorrow, and I hope you've all enjoyed it. I thoroughly have, and we wait and see what tomorrow brings. But don't go anywhere. There's still lots of wildlife coming your way. But I will be back again tomorrow, same time, same place. Well, that's it from me for now, folks. Bush greetings. Give it horns. Cheers.